Nurture your garden with these simple steps.
Welcome to the Wellbeing Garden, where you'll learn, grow and thrive with expert horticulturalist Cath Manuel.
Hello, welcome to the Wellbeing Garden. I'm Cath Manuel. As a horticulturist, I get asked pretty regularly about ways to deal with pests in the garden, how to get rid of weeds, improve dry soil, and many things that gardeners find really challenging out in their gardens quite regularly. So I thought in this episode, I'll cover some simple things that you can do to just help you avoid those garden problems and have extra success out in your garden, which as gardeners, we all want success. We all want that thriving, beautiful garden that we dream of. So a couple of things I want you to consider when you're nurturing your garden. So the first thing is I'm going to ask you to consider, are you growing plants suitable for your climate? Now, when I talk climate, I live in Queensland in Australia, so our climate here where I'm located is subtropical. So when I'm choosing plants for my garden, I want to make sure that they grow in subtropical climates. So you might be in a temperate zone or a cool zone or an arid zone or a tropical zone. And when you're choosing your plants, just make sure that those plants are going to grow happily in the climate that you live in. So where I am in the subtropics, I wouldn't choose cool climate plants here because once we get to the heat of summer or even spring, they will struggle. The other thing with that is we don't have very low winter or cool season temperatures. And your cool plants need low days below certain temperatures to actually bear fruit or to grow and actually thrive. So when you're choosing plants to grow in your garden, make sure that they're suitable for the climate that you live in, and they will grow absolutely beautiful and happy wherever you plant them in your garden. The next thing to consider is to grow a mix of perennials and annuals. Now, when I talk about perennials and annuals, they're the way that the plants grow. So I call perennials the forever plants. They grow forever, provided you're looking after them and you're growing them in the right climate. They're the forever plants. So an example of those is rosemary, lavender, most of your fruit trees, a lot of beautiful shrubs that you have growing maybe as ornamental shrubs are going to be perennial plants. So you generally just plant them once and look after them and they grow beautifully for you. Now the other side of that is annuals, and that means that they have one life cycle. They have one growth cycle. Say an example of that is a lettuce. So you plant a lettuce and when it's grown, you cut it out of the garden or remove the leaves and eat them, and then the plant dies off and you have to plant another one in its place. Now, grow a mix of perennials and annuals throughout your garden does save you time and money. So recently it's been summer here in Australia. It's been very hot here on the east coast. We've actually had lacking water here, very high temperatures. And I've had no annuals at all growing in my garden over summer. So for those hot months here, which is really harsh in the garden, I just grow perennial plants because I know they will survive better. So I haven't had any annuals in, but the perennials have survived the heat of summer. They've grown beautifully. At times they've struggled a little with the heat and they may need an extra dose of water, but the perennials have grown through and they've given me some extra herbs and some extra fruit through those summer months when I don't have the annuals growing. So now what I'll be doing is preparing my gardens as we're coming up to autumn soon. I'll be preparing my gardens and getting my annual plants ready for planting coming into autumn. So that's going to be cooler crops for me. So when I talk cool season crops for annuals, I'm talking broccoli and kale and some cabbage and cauliflower. They're going to be our winter crops going in. So they will go in the garden amongst the perennials that have been growing beautifully throughout summer. So make sure you grow a mix of perennials and annuals in your garden. That saves you a little bit of time and money as well. The next thing is to make sure you feed your fruit trees regularly. Now, I like to do everything really simple methods. If you've listened to any of my other podcast episodes, or you follow me through our Soil to Supper Club and through our Facebook group, the Soil to Supper Club, you'll know I love simple methods of doing things. I like to still achieve the same outcome. I like everything to grow and thrive, but I like to do everything the simple way. I lead a busy life, so I need to do that to ensure that everything grows. One of the things that I do with feeding my fruit trees is I pretty much feed them 4 times a year. And I work on the season calendar so I can remember when a new season comes along. I know it's time to feed my fruit trees. I just don't like to overcomplicate things, so I keep it very simple. Feeding your fruit trees 4 times a year gives them 3 months of growth and nutrients going into the soil. So I make sure that I use a blend of compost that I've made or some rotted manure that I might get my hands on. I blend in with that some blood and bone and a little bit of, say, a handful of a slow release organic fertilizer pellets. I like to blend the two different fertilizers, and then I mix it through the compost or the rotted animal manure and spread that around the base of the tree. Now I make sure I go out to the drip line of the tree, and that's where the foliage ends and the sort of the water drips down onto the ground as far out as the branches and stems of the tree go. I take my fertilizer out to the drip line around the tree on the ground, and I keep it about 5 to 10 centimeters away from the main trunk or stem of the tree or the shrub, so it doesn't go against the stem and rot out the tree. I then give it a good soak of water or a watering can with diluted liquid fertilizer in it, and then I lay some mulch, either some hay or some cane mulch, all around the tree. And that's really simple to do. It might take me maybe half an hour to do a couple of trees. It's quite a nice activity to do 4 times a year, and that ensures those trees go through the season with the fertilizers that they need to grow and to produce a really good crop for me. Now, for some hungry plants, like say here we have bananas, and they are a little hungrier than most. So they get an extra application every second month of just some slow release or fertilizer, just the little organic pellets, usually a chook manure or something like that. So they just get an extra feed around them, but generally most of my fruit trees, so that's my citrus and other tropical fruit trees, get a feed every season. That's 4 times a year. And the way I remember that is the change of the season through the calendar. So I don't have to actually write that down or record that anywhere. If it's a new season, it's time to feed the fruit trees. Now, the next thing you need to look at to nurture your garden is irrigation. And this is something I do get asked a lot in the past with my clients that I work one-on-one with. I do assist them with their irrigation system if they've got an automatic timer or an automatic systems through their garden. We really need to make sure that you're checking the pipes regularly, checking those little sprayers and drippers to make sure that ants haven't moved in, especially if you haven't used the irrigation system for a little while. It's really good to check that the sprayers or the little drippers aren't full of ants or dirt or anything else that's going to stop the water coming through. You also need to check the timer, and if you're using an automatic timer, just make sure that it's coming on at the correct time of day and for the correct amount of time to suit your garden and what your garden needs are. So you might need to check your timer, say coming into summer or coming into winter, because summer you would want to be getting that irrigation going in the evenings or very late afternoon. And then coming into winter, you want to change that to be watering during the mornings, not the afternoon, because at night the temperature drops and you don't want your plants to have wet foliage or the soil wet, because then you can get fungal diseases in the soil. So just check your irrigation timer, adjust it for the seasons, and also regularly check your sprayers and the irrigation pipes just to make sure there's no holes. In the past, I've come across gardens that certain parts of the gardens have been dying, and my clients can't work out, why is that plant over there, that area, dying when everything else is growing. And when we've had a closer look, the irrigation either had a hole in the pipe or the sprayers were blocked, and those plants were missing out on water. But the clients hadn't checked them for a few weeks, just assumed that everything was working properly and the garden was getting watered, but some of the plants were missing out and then they were suffering. So if you're using an irrigation system, especially if you're using an automatic timer, just make sure you check in with those regularly to make sure that it's all working well. The other system that you could do is, if you wanted to set it up by hand, is use some of those hoses that have the little holes in it, and you connect it to your hose and you turn it on. You might want to set a timer on your phone or a kitchen timer or something, and just give your garden 5 or 10 minutes. You want to aim for a nice deep soak every couple of days through the warm months, rather than a shallow 2 or 3 or 5 minute soak every day, because you want to make sure that that water goes deep down into the layers of soil and into the roots. So using those little dripper hoses are also a great way of doing it, but make sure that you're giving your garden a good thorough deep soak, not just a little sparing kind of sprinkle every day, because that's not going to encourage good strong root systems. Okay, the next one I want to chat about is removing weeds. Now, all gardeners, including me, hands up, have problems with weeds in the garden. It's something that we can't avoid. A definition of a weed is something growing where it's not wanted. So a weed could actually be a beautiful little herb that someone else might think that's a gorgeous plant, and you think, oh, it's a disaster because it's taking over my garden. Now, with weeds or plants that you don't want growing on your garden, the best way to get on top of those and remove them is, no, not with chemicals. Please don't think straight up chemicals. They are something you don't even want to consider at all. The first thing you can do is remove them by hand. Now, I know that's like a back-breaking job and it takes a lot of time. I actually find weeding a little bit therapeutic. I'll listen to a podcast or some great music with my headphones, and I'll get outside in the cool of the day and just spend a half an hour just pulling weeds and contemplating my day. It is quite a therapeutic thing to do. Now, the best way of removing weeds is by hand, because you want to make sure that you get the weeds out before they go to seed. Now, once weeds go to seed and those seeds disperse everywhere and spread out in your garden, usually the reason why those plants have become a weed is because they have a really high germination rate. Those seeds that are spreading out and going everywhere in the garden are generally going to sprout, which means then you've got more weeds popping up through the garden. So if you can remove weeds by hand, especially before they're going to seed, you're going to minimize the weed problems in your garden. Now, you want to throw out those seeds, get rid of them, get the plants out before they go to flower if you can. But if you do come across seeds, you don't want them going into your compost or any other parts of your garden. The stems and the roots of some of the weeds are okay to go in the compost, but I would identify what plants they are before you decide to put them in the compost, because there's some nasty weeds I would not suggest at all to go in the compost, but some of them aren't too bad. So you do need to try and identify that weed before putting it in the compost or somewhere else in your garden. And if you're not sure about identifying weeds, you can take a photo and post it in our Soil to Supper Club Facebook group. And I'm in there most days, and I can have a look at the picture and I can identify that weed, and then I'd be happy to let you know whether it's okay for the compost or it's a nasty one and you want to ditch it. So if you're unsure about plants or weeds, pop into our Facebook group and send me a photo. Now, the other thing you can do with weeds once they've been removed is you can soak them in a bucket of water, or you can place them in a black plastic bag and leave them out in the sun for about 4 to 6 weeks. Now, that will definitely kill off the plant, but when it gets to that very high temperature in the plastic bag, it will inhibit the seeds from sprouting. So generally then it's okay then after that time to put the weeds into the compost. Or if you're soaking your weeds in a bucket of water, let them go for a few weeks. They'll get a little bit stinky and then they can go to the compost after that. But again, if you're unsure of what that particular weed is and you think it could become a really nasty problem, just to check the name of the weed or what it is, pop it into our Facebook group and I'll help you identify that, and then together we can have a look to see if it's something that's okay to go to the compost or you should totally remove it. Now, there are noxious weeds, and in all areas around the world, our local councils and governments put out information on weeds and plants that are dangerous and cause problems to our environment. So if you're unsure, always check with your local council to see if that plant is a noxious weed, and they generally provide information on how to deal with those. And there are some very nasty plants which cause problems throughout natural bush areas, and we want to make sure that we're not spreading those around anywhere else. So the best thing to do is keep on top of weeds in your garden, and you're going to be helping your community and natural areas as well. The other thing you can do over large weedy areas, if you didn't want to pull them out by hand, you could sheet mulch over the top. Now, sheet mulching is a method of laying newspaper or cardboard, or in my case, in large areas, I lay cotton bed sheets down straight over the weedy areas, and then I cover that in a mulch. And what that does is that cover will suppress and kill off the weeds, and then after that I can either build a garden on top or pathways or something like that. So sheet mulching is another good method for naturally killing off weeds and creating beautiful new garden spaces. Now, the next thing to consider to get your garden thriving is make sure you've got your in-garden compost system. Now, I know I've spoken about this a lot before. I know what you're thinking in other episodes and blogs, so I don't need to tell you how important it is to compost. If you want a thriving garden, you must have a compost system in your garden. Now, if you're composting, and I really hope you are, make sure that you keep it watered. A lot of people say to me, I'm composting and I really enjoy recycling my food scraps and garden waste, which I totally love, but then they say, but it's not breaking down and it's full of ants and I don't know what to do now. So if your compost is really dry, it's not going to decompose so much. It actually needs moisture. Water is one of the important ingredients in compost. So what you need to do is make sure that you keep your ingredients inside the compost bins watered. You don't want them too wet, like you don't want it soaking wet because then it can rot and become stinky. But you want a really nice balance of water in there. A really good way of doing it is give your compost a squeeze, or give the mulches a bit of a squeeze, and you can kind of see the water dripping a little bit through your fingers, but not pouring out of your hands. So make sure that you keep your compost watered, and you won't get the ants in there, and you will get your ingredients decomposing much quicker, which means that you have beautiful fresh compost to grow in your garden in. Okay. I will put lots of information into today's episode description with links back for each of these little tips for you to follow. So there will be my in-garden composting method in the episode notes for you to click through and follow my method how to compost straight into your garden. Now, the next tip, coming back to growing plants, if you want your garden to be really thriving, make sure when it comes to your seasonal crops, especially with your annuals, that you are growing your plants to suit the current season. So I've already mentioned growing perennials and annuals, and how coming into autumn and winter, the annual crops that I'll be growing, make sure that you're growing the plants that suit the current season. So for me, coming into autumn and winter, I want to make sure I'm growing cool season crops. I'm not planting summer crops. I won't be planting tomatoes or eggplants coming into winter because they won't survive. If they are happy growing from autumn into winter, and they're growing into the early parts of winter, they're going to be okay. But if they're warm season plants and we get hit with some cold nights or some frost, they're not going to survive at all. So when you're choosing your seasonal crops, and this is especially for your edible crops and your herbs, make sure that you're growing plants that suit your current season. So in the southern hemisphere, we're coming up to autumn. So we'll be choosing autumn and winter crops in our garden now. But for our gardeners in the northern hemisphere, lucky you, you're coming into spring, which is a beautiful time of year, and into summer. So you'll be choosing your warmer crops to grow. So make sure that you choose the correct plants for the current season. Those plants will then thrive and grow beautifully and produce food and produce leaves and an abundant crop for you. They'll also grow very well. If they're growing in the wrong season, they'll struggle a lot and they'll get hit with pests and diseases, and they really won't produce the abundant crops you want. So best way to have beautiful crops and a really productive garden is to grow the plants that are suitable for the current season you're in. So these are just a few things that we cover when we're looking at our garden thriving. There's a few other things that you really should consider as far as planning and designing your garden, what soil you're using, what fertilizers you're using. I could cover a lot more, but these ones are just the basics, and I want you to go back to your garden and really think, are you following these methods? Just a couple of little simple things that you can do to maybe tweak what you're already doing out in the garden for your garden to grow and thrive and be more successful than it already is. Now, you'll find links in the show description, so have a read through there, and I'll put some extra information for you to follow on seasonal planting, feeding your fruit trees, getting your compost nice and damp so it's decomposing, looking after weeds and removing weeds in your garden, and lots of little things to help you grow and thrive. So thank you so much for joining me in the Wellbeing Garden today. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and I've given you a little maybe food for thought for you and your garden, and now you're ready to head outside and give these things a try. So I look forward to seeing you next time in the Wellbeing Garden. Enjoy an amazing day.